Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from RAU'S IAS Study Circle.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 23rd February 2022, and the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion. The most important news in today's newspaper is related to the Ukrainian crisis. We all are aware that the Ukrainian crisis had been building up for past few months in the Europe because of the Russian assertion and fears of Russian invasion. However, the invasion has not exactly taken place in the terms in which the world was expecting. And it has taken place in the form of Russia recognizing the independence of two territories of Ukraine, that is Donetsk and Luhansk, which are combinedly called as the Donbas region of Ukraine. And because of the recognition of the independence of these two territories of Donbas region of Ukraine, Russia is now sending what it calls as peacekeeping forces. Now, this deployment of Russian troops in the Donbas region of Ukraine has been claimed by the United States of America as an invasion of Ukraine. And that is why it is likely to announce sanctions in the coming days. And based on this news of recognition of independence of the Donbas region of Ukraine by Russia, there are 4 articles in today's newspaper which highlight the different dimensions of this particular issue that is happening in the Europe, and which is a very crucial, important development in the international geopolitics. So in this discussion, we'll try to understand this issue of Ukrainian crisis holistically in terms of what exactly are the roots of this Ukrainian crisis. Also, we'll look at why is Russia asserting itself in the Ukrainian territory, and why is Ukraine important to Russia, and what exactly is the history of NATO's expansionism in the Russia's neighborhood, which has started the issue of Ukrainian crisis again. And lastly, we will look at India's stand and what are the issues that India is likely to face because of the Russian recognition of these territories of Ukraine as independent. So when the Ukrainian crisis started back in 2014, these two territories of eastern Ukraine or southeastern Ukraine claimed independence from Ukraine. That is the Donetsk People Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. However, despite claims of independence from Ukraine, these two territories were not recognized internationally as independent republics, and that is why they were still considered to be part of Ukraine. However, now a major geopolitical event has taken place in terms of Russia recognizing the independence of both these territories from Ukraine, that is the Donetsk People Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Now, the issue here is that both these territories of Donetsk and Luhansk claim territories larger than the ones that are in their control presently. So the territory that is claimed by the Donetsk People Republic is the one which is here in the grey color. That is the Donetsk Oblast, and the Luhansk People's Republic claims Luhansk Oblast as its part. And the fear now is that the troops of Russia that will be deployed in the Donetsk People Republic and the Luhansk People Republic will use their force to claim these territories which are claimed as independent by both these Donetsk as well as Luhansk, which are commonly called as the Donbas region. So as you can see, the Luhansk People Republic claims all the territory of Luhansk Oblast, and the Donetsk People Republic claims all the territory of Donetsk Oblast. And Russia could conduct offensive operations against Ukraine to expand the proxies' territorial control to include all of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts. So this exactly is the issue at hand. Despite the recognition of these two territories of Donetsk People Republic and Luhansk People Republic as independent by Russia, there are still fears that these two independent republics claim a territory which is larger than the one which is under their control presently. And as such, Russia can conduct operations to take control of these expanded territories from the present situation. Now, to understand the present crisis in the Ukraine, we have to go into the Cold War politics. And we all are aware that in the Cold War period, the world was divided into two camps, one led by the United States of America and the other led by the erstwhile USSR or the Soviet Union. And in this Cold War time, Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union or the erstwhile USSR. However, in 1991, when the USSR disintegrated, Ukraine became an independent nation. However, issue in Ukraine started in 2004 with a revolution that is named as 2004 Orange Revolution. And this Orange Revolution became an important revolution in Ukraine because rigging was claimed in the presidential election that was won by the pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych. In this line, the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych continued to be the president for a very long period of time. However, in 2014, there was another revolution that took place in the Ukraine that was known as Revolution of Dignity. And in this, there were widespread protests which toppled the pro-Russian Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. Now, during this 2014 revolution, when the Ukrainian president was removed and there was a vacuum at the top, Russia utilized this opportunity to annex what is called as the Crimean Peninsula. So if you look at this map, this is the Crimean Peninsula, which is surrounded by the Black Sea. And when Russia claimed the Crimean Peninsula, conflict soon broke out between the Ukrainian government and the Russian-backed separatists who declared the two regions of the eastern Ukraine, that is the Donetsk and the Luhansk, as self-proclaimed republics. However, these two were not recognized by the international community as independent republics. However, presently, Russia has now recognized the independence of both these territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, which are commonly known as the Donbas region of Ukraine, which shares a border with Russia. So the sequence of the events are that Ukraine gained independence from the erstwhile USSR in 1991 when the USSR got disintegrated. And in 2004, it witnessed an orange revolution because of the rigging in the election in which the pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych won the election. He continued as president for a long period of time, and in 2014 again there was a revolution of dignity in which this pro-Russian president was removed and there was a power vacuum in Ukraine. In this background, Russia utilized this moment to annex the Crimean Peninsula, which is surrounded by the Black Sea. And at this same particular time, conflict broke out in the eastern territories of Ukraine, that is the Donetsk and Luhansk region, which is commonly called as Donbas, and these two claimed independence. However, their independence was not recognized by the international community. But now Russia has recognized their independence, and once Russia has recognized its independence, it has sent its peacekeeping forces into these regions. Now, if we want to understand why is Russia interested in Ukraine, we'll have to first understand the strategic calculations of Russia and also the NATO's expansionist policies in Russia's neighborhood. The USSR got disintegrated in 1991, and some of the republics which were part of the erstwhile USSR got their independence from Russia. That is Ukraine, Kazakhstan, these are some Central Asian republics, and also countries on the western part of Russia, these were all part of the erstwhile USSR. However, all these countries got their independence after the disintegration of USSR. Now, if you look at the present location of Russia, it does not have natural borders except for Arctic region and the Pacific region. That is, it is surrounded by different countries in the European part, especially on the western borders as well as on the southern borders. And since the borders on the western part of Russia are not natural in nature, these are plain territories. And that is why Russia fears that an attack can take place on Russia from the western part, which is a plain area. And that is why it sees that it is vulnerable to attack from this western part, which is sometimes seen to be under the influence of the NATO, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formulated during the Cold War period as a security organization by the US-led countries. And as a response to NATO, the USSR created what was known as the Warsaw Pact. And some of the countries in the western part of the Europe are part of the NATO. And the issue here is that the NATO has been trying to expand itself by incorporating various countries in the Russian neighborhood, which were once a part of the erstwhile USSR. And this has threatened the security of the Russian state, or at least Russia perceives it this way. Further, if you look at the history of Russia, Russia has faced two devastating attacks in the past from this western side. And these include the 1812 attack by the Napoleonic forces and also the 1941 attack by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Now, although in both these wars Russia came out as victorious, but it suffered huge material and human losses. And because of the history of such devastating attacks by the Nazi Germany and the Napoleonic France, Russia tried to control the smaller countries that were on the border of Russia. And that is why it tried to integrate these countries into what was known as the erstwhile USSR. And that is why all these countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and the Central Asian republics were incorporated into the larger Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. However, when USSR disintegrated in 1990s and the Cold War ended, these countries which Russia had incorporated into the USSR got independence, and that is why the strategic calculations of Russia were affected once again. However, Russia still considers these countries to be important for the Russian security, and that is why Russia is again reasserting itself in these smaller republics which were once a part of the erstwhile USSR. So, the first reason related to Russian assertion in Ukraine is related to its strategic calculations in the form of integrating the erstwhile republics that were part of the erstwhile USSR. The second reason is that it is in response to NATO's expansionism. Now, it needs to be understood that the Western countries, which were led by US and the European countries, which are part of NATO, had promised that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would not expand in the east towards Russia. However, NATO did not keep its promises, and in 1999, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, which were all the members of the Soviet led Warsaw Pact, had joined NATO. 5 years later, 7 more countries, including the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which share the borders with Russia, were also incorporated into NATO. And further, NATO had invited Ukraine to become a part of the NATO, and this did not go well with Russia. And that is why Russia does not want Ukraine to fall into the hands of North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries. And this mainly is because of the strategic calculations of Russia, where it does not want to be surrounded by the NATO countries. Further, out of the countries that surround Black Sea, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania are all NATO members. And that is why Russia feels threatened because of being surrounded by the NATO countries on its western borders and also the countries which surround the Black Sea. And that is why if Ukraine and Georgia join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Russia's gateway to the Mediterranean Sea would be narrowed. And that is why Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula to secure its access to Black Sea. So the second reason why Russia is asserting itself in Ukraine is to stop the NATO's expansionism in its neighborhood. And also, Russia wants to have a larger access to the Black Sea so that it can further have the access to Mediterranean Sea. And that is why Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula also. So if you look at the Russia's access to the Black Sea, already Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania are all NATO members. Further, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, it is likely to threaten the Russian security and will also narrow down its access to the Black Sea, from which it can gain access into the Mediterranean Sea. And that is why Russia had annexed the Crimean Peninsula back in 2014, and again it is now claiming independence of the eastern part of Ukraine in the form of independence of the Donbas region, where Russia has sent its troops. Now, this Russian assertion on the Ukraine is not just a standalone event of Russia's assertion on the erstwhile territories of the USSR. Another event, that is South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the self-proclaimed republics, broke away from Georgia, are now controlled by Russian-backed forces. Further, in Ukraine, we all are aware that the eastern Donbas region has been recognized as Independent Republic of the Ukraine. Further, Russia had supported the president of Belarus against the protests that erupted in 2020. Also, Russia sent thousands of peacekeeping forces to end the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And this was seen as a major step of Russia re-establishing its strategic dominance. Further, Belarus, with the Russian support, had manufactured a migrant crisis on the Polish border of the European Union. And also in the recent protests that took place in Kazakhstan, Russia had dispatched its troops to stop these protests. So all these events highlight that Russia has been focusing on the rimland countries, which are the countries which got disintegrated from the erstwhile USSR. And this event of the Ukrainian crisis is not just a standalone event and is in line with the Russia's strategy of reasserting itself in the erstwhile territories of the erstwhile USSR. A key term in news related to the Ukrainian crisis is the Minsk process. However, this Minsk process has ended with the Russian recognition of the eastern republics in the Ukraine. Now, these two processes, that is the Minsk I and Minsk II Accords, were reached in 2014 and 2015 between the rebels in the eastern part of Ukraine, that is in the Donetsk and the Luhansk region or the Donbas region. And based on this Minsk process, a ceasefire was signed between the Russian backed rebels in the Ukraine's Donbas region, and a formula was put forward for resolving the conflict. However, the terms of these processes were never implemented on the ground, and after the Russian recognition of independence of the Donbas region, the Minsk process has ended. So, from prelims perspective, Minsk process is related to the Ukrainian crisis, especially regarding the ceasefire in the Donbas region of Ukraine. Now, this brings us to India's stand on the Russian recognition of the independence of the Donbas region. In this, India has said that the escalation of tensions along the border between Ukraine and Russian Federation was a matter of deep concern, and that these developments had the potential to undermine peace and security in the region. However, India has not condemned Russia's statement of recognition of the independence of the Donbas region. And at the same time, India has been insisting upon the diplomatic resolution of this crisis. Further, the Indian statement did not use the words territorial integrity and sovereignty, which India has always been referring to in the context of Chinese aggressive behavior, especially in the Ladakh region. Such a calculated statement has been given by India because India considers Russia as a strategic and privileged partner. And this is mainly because India is dependent upon defense imports from Russia, and Russia has been one of the biggest and the important defense partners for India. In this context, it becomes important for us to understand what could be the impact of this Ukrainian crisis on the overall geopolitics, which can have impact on India's interests. Let us look at all these aspects now. So, if you look at the impact of this Ukrainian crisis on India, we all are aware that India has traditionally had close relations with Russia and the erstwhile USSR. However, of late, we are hearing that India has been tilting towards the United States of America. This has mainly been because of the disintegration of the erstwhile USSR and also US being one of the important economic partners of India. And at the same time, both India and US have been strategically aligning because of the finalization of the defense agreements and the concept of the Indo-Pacific and alignment in the form of the Quad countries, where Japan and Australia are the other partners. However, at the same time, it needs to be understood that Russia is a major supplier of defense equipment to India. And because of the present crisis that is happening in Ukraine and Russia's position on the Ukraine and the reaction of the Western world against Russia has strengthened the China-Russia partnership or the Sino-Russian partnership. Now the problem here is that because of this strengthening China-Russia axis, it might curtail the Russian ability to support India in case of a conflict between India and China. So in case of a conflict between India and China, Russia's ability to support India might be curtailed because of the present improving relations between Russia and China and the strengthening of this axis, especially because of the Ukrainian crisis and the response of the Western countries. Further, we are aware that India is involved in the S-400 missile deal with Russia, and there have been fears of sanctions under the CAATSA law of United States of America. However, till now, India has cleverly avoided the sanctions under the CAATSA law by the United States of America. However, if a warlike situation arises or the crisis further deepens, such sanctions could be imposed. And sanctions under the CAATSA law could also be imposed on various defense supplies by the Russia. And such curtailed defense supplies will impact India's ability to respond to China in case of a conflict between India and China. That is a cause of concern for India. Another important concern for India is that because of the Ukrainian crisis, now the European countries will be focusing on the Ukraine and their attention will be diverted from the Indo-Pacific region. And India wanted the European countries to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, especially in order to deter the Chinese ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. And last but not the least, Russia, which remains one of the important suppliers of oil and gas, if sanctions are imposed on Russia's trade in oil and gas with the European countries, the oil prices or the crude oil prices might increase. and this is going to impact India's energy security. That is, the increase in the oil prices can have an impact on India's energy security. So these are few likely impacts of this Ukrainian crisis on India's position in the geopolitics that is unfolding. Further, as a reaction to the Russian move on Ukraine, Germany has halted the certification of Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. Now, this pipeline connects Russia with Germany and passes through the Baltic Sea. However, Germany has now halted the certification of this $11.6 billion Russian gas pipeline project. Now, the issue here is that the European countries have been dependent upon the Russian gas supplies. However, because of this Ukrainian crisis, if the supply of the gas is halted from Russia, it might lead to increased prices of the gas in the European countries. And that again might have an escalating impact on the oil and gas prices across the globe. But this is the move of Germany, that it has halted the Nord 2 gas pipeline. And this is an important aspect for us from the prelims examination perspective, that the Nord 2 gas pipeline connects Russia with Germany and passes through the Baltic Sea. This news article on page number 1 is related to Armed Force Special Powers Act. And this was in news because of a botched up operation of army in Nagaland, which led to the killing of 13 civilians. And after that, there were calls for removal of AFSPA from Nagaland and the northeastern states of India. In this background, the Union Home Ministry constituted a committee to look into the removal of AFSPA. And a deadline was set up for this committee to give its report regarding the removal of AFSPA, which was set at about 45 days. However, this committee is likely to miss this deadline. In this backdrop, let us revise from a previous DNS video the various issues associated with AFSPA and what are its controversial provisions. And if you look at the UPSC syllabus in the General Studies paper 3 in the mains examination, under the security, AFSPA becomes a very important aspect for us from the mains examination perspective. And if you look at this question that was asked in 2015, it still remains relevant related to the AFSPA. The question read, human rights activists constantly highlight the fact that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958 is a draconian act leading to cases of human rights abuses by the security forces. What sections of AFSPA are opposed by the activists? Critically evaluate the requirement with reference to the view held by the Apex Court. So basically, this question that was asked in 2015 regarding the human rights abuses by the armed forces under the AFSPA Act are still relevant in the light of the recent incident that has happened in Nagaland. So in this analysis, let us try and understand what is AFSPA, why was it created, where it is currently operating, and also what are the arguments in favor and against the deployment of AFSPA in some of the states in northeastern states of India. Plus, in this regard, we'll look at the observations by the Supreme Court and various committees that have been formed related to the Armed Force Special Powers Act. And all these points can be used in writing the answers related to AFSPA in the mains examination. Now, this is one of those topics where we need to take a stand on the issue of protecting the sovereignty of India and protecting the states against armed rebellion on the one hand, and on the other hand, we also need to check or control the human rights abuses by the armed forces. That is why these are some of the difficult questions where we need to take a stand while writing the answers in the mains examination. And that is what makes such kind of questions really difficult in the exam-like scenario. So let us analyze the issue properly, and only then we will be able to take an informed stand on these issues. So let us start with what exactly is AFSPA and what are the powers that have been provided under the AFSPA to the armed forces. So if you look at the Armed Force Special Powers Act, it was enacted first in 1958. Before this, it was even enacted during the British times in 1942 to stop the Quit India movement. However, after the independence, it was enacted in 1958. It is an act of Parliament of India and it grants special powers to the Indian Armed Forces to maintain public order in disturbed areas. Normally, we are aware that the maintenance of public order is a state subject and the police of that particular state is responsible for maintenance of law and order. However, in areas that are declared as disturbed under the AFSPA, the Indian Armed Forces are provided with powers to maintain the public order in disturbed areas. That is why, or this is what makes the AFSPA special. If you look at the applicability of the AFSPA that has been provided in the Act itself, it is applicable to 7 states of northeastern India, including Assam, Manipur, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, and Tripura. These are the states where the AFSPA can be implemented or it can be applied. Besides the northeastern state, the AFSPA Act was also brought out for Jammu and Kashmir in 1990, and it is still continuing in Jammu and Kashmir. Further, it was also applied to Punjab in 1983 and it was later repealed for Punjab. Now, what are the powers of the central and the state government in this regard? So, AFSPA basically empowers the governor of the state as well as the central government to declare any part of the state as disturbed area if, in its opinion, there exists a dangerous situation in the said area which makes it necessary to deploy armed forces in the region. So, basically, it is the discretion of the governor, and based on that assessment, the governor can send a report to the central government and which can implement the or apply the AFSPA in a particular area and declare that area as a disturbed area. And that is when AFSPA will come in and the powers will be provided to the armed forces to maintain law and order or public order in these disturbed areas. Now, when this AFSPA Act was enacted in 1958, the objective that was highlighted in the Act itself was that, keeping in view the duty of the Union under Article 355 of the Indian Constitution, which provides that it is the duty of the central government to protect every state against internal disturbance and external aggression, it is considered desirable that the central government should also have power to declare areas as disturbed and to enable its armed forces to exercise special powers. So this was the thing that was highlighted in the objective associated with the Armed Force Special Powers Act. That is, the government is enacting this act in its power that has been provided to it under the Article 355 to protect the states of the India against external aggression as well as internal disturbances. And that is why, by using this power, the government of India enacted the Armed Force Special Powers Act. Now, where is it currently applicable or where is it being applied right now? Now, earlier the AFSPA was applied to all the 7 states in the northeastern India. However, it was removed gradually, and AFSPA was removed from entire Tripura in 2015 and from Meghalaya in 2018. And currently it continues to be in force in Assam, some of the districts of Assam, Manipur, Nagaland, and 3 districts of Arunachal Pradesh. So these are the 4 states where the AFSPA is still applicable. This brings us to what are the special powers that have been provided to the army officers under the AFSPA Act, and why are these vulnerable to misuse by the armed forces. The first power that has been provided to the army officers is that they can, after giving due warning, fire upon or use other kinds of force even if it causes death. So it provides great amount of power to the armed forces to maintain the public order in such disturbed areas. Secondly, the army officers can destroy any arms dump, hideout, or prepared or fortified positions or shelter or any kind of training camp. Further, it provides the army officers with power to arrest without a warrant anyone who has committed cognizable offences or is reasonably suspected of having done so and may use force if needed for the arrest. So you can see the army can arrest even without a warrant, and on the basis of mere suspicion, the army can arrest a person in these disturbed areas. Also, the army has been provided to enter and search any premise in order to make such arrests. Further, the army has been empowered to stop and search any vehicle or vessel reasonably suspected to be carrying such persons or weapons. Further, any person who is arrested or taken into custody under this act shall be made present over to the officer in charge of the nearest police station with least possible delay, together with a report of circumstances occasioning the arrest. However, the army officers have legal immunity for their actions, and there can be no prosecution, suit, or any other legal proceedings anyone acting under this law. Further, the government's judgment on why a particular area is found to be disturbed is not subject to judicial review under the AFSPA. And further, the army officers are also protected under this act from prosecution, suit, or any other legal proceedings except with the sanction of the central government. That is, prior consent or prior sanction of the central government is required if an army officer has to be prosecuted under his acts of AFSPA. So these are the provisions that have been provided with, or these are the special powers that have been provided to the armed officers or army officers in the AFSPA areas. So first is that the army officers can fire upon or use any kind of force even if it causes death. Further, the army officers are empowered to destroy hideouts or any fortified positions. They can arrest without a warning and on mere suspicion. Also, they can search or enter any premises based on the suspicion. Plus, they can stop and search any vehicle, and for this they have been provided with legal immunity for their actions. Plus, there can be no prosecution suit or any legal proceeding against anyone acting under this law. And also, the government's judgment on why a particular area is found to be disturbed area is also protected from judicial review. And finally, if an army officer is to be prosecuted based on his acts under the AFSPA Act, a prior sanction is required from the central government for such prosecution. So this is the level of protection that has been provided to the army officers under the AFSPA Act. And that is what makes it vulnerable to misuse at times. In this regard, let us look at some of the arguments in favor and some of the arguments against the application of AFSPA. Now, looking at the arguments in favor of the AFSPA, we are already aware that the Constitution of India provides the central government the responsibility of protecting the states against external aggression and internal disturbances under the Article 355. And that is why such kind of acts are required to protect these areas from insurgency. And also, the AFSPA is needed to maintain the morale of the force, because in the absence of such powers that have been provided to the armed officers, they cannot maintain the public order in such disturbed areas. Further, in lack of any such kind of powers, the insurgents will have upper hand in such areas. Also, the troops need such powers because army is only deployed when national security is at serious risk from the armed combatants. That is, it is applied as a measure of last resort. And even in the northeastern state, it has been removed completely from Tripura and Meghalaya. So this shows that it is used as a measure of last resort. However, there are various arguments against the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. First is that the provision for immunity of the security forces urges the security officers to act more brutally rather than acting responsibly at times. Also, the AFSPA is sometimes seen as one of the major reasons for increasing radicalization in the insurgency-ridden areas because of the little accountability for the excesses that are committed in the discharge of power given by the Act. And this also remains one of the bone of contention between the insurgent groups which are in peace talks with the central government. And that is why sometimes it is argued that for the peace talks to be successful, first the AFSPA has to be removed. Further, the instances of abuse and extrajudicial killings in Manipur have been upheld even by the Supreme Court in 2016, which highlight that the provisions of the AFSPA, or the powers that are provided under the AFSPA, which are unchecked powers, are sometimes vulnerable to misuse by the armed forces, which has been proven by the Supreme Court in the killings in Manipur in 2016. In this line, the Supreme Court ruled that the armed forces cannot escape investigation for excesses in the course of discharge of their duty, even in the disturbed areas. That is, they should be held accountable if they are misusing their powers that have been provided to them under the Armed Force Special Powers Act. Further, it is argued that even after the application of AFSPA for so many years, if the situation in such states has not changed, this points to the flaws in the application of such laws in themselves. That is, a broader strategy is required and not just the provision of special powers under the AFSPA or declaring a particular area as disturbed area will not solve the problem in the long run. So these are some of the arguments in favor, and these are some of the arguments against the imposition of AFSPA. In this regard, let us look at some of the observations of Supreme Court and the various committees that have been created on the AFSPA. If you look at the Supreme Court's observation of 1998, it had recommended that a suo motu declaration can be made by the central government. However, it is desirable that the state government should also be conducted by the central government before making such declaration. So we are seeing that the Chief Minister of Nagaland is saying that the AFSPA should be revealed. This clearly shows that the CM of the Nagaland has not been consulted, and his views should also be taken into account while imposing or declaring an area as disturbed area under the Armed Force Special Powers Act. Secondly, the Supreme Court observed that the AFSPA does not confer arbitrary powers to declare any area as disturbed area. And in this line, it has highlighted that the declaration has to be for a limited duration, and there should be periodic review of declaration after 6 months have expired. Also, while exercising the powers that are conferred upon the army officers under the AFSPA, the authorized officer should use minimal force necessary for effective action. Also, the authorized officers should strictly follow the do's and the don'ts that are issued by the army in charge in that particular area. So clearly, the Supreme Court in its 1998 observation has highlighted the issues in the application of AFSPA in some cases, and it has also cautioned that what should be the proper way in which the AFSPA should be implemented in these areas. That is, consultation should be made with the state governments before making the declaration of any area as disturbed area. Also, the powers that are provided under AFSPA are not arbitrary powers, and the officers that are acting under the AFSPA should use minimal force necessary for effective action. Then the Santosh Hegde Commission that was set up by the Supreme Court on the Manipur encounter deaths has also highlighted some of the issues. So the commission suggested fixing a time frame of 3 months for the central government to decide whether to prosecute any security personnel engaged in extrajudicial killings or unruly behavior in insurgency hit regions. So it has suggested fixing a time frame of 3 months for the central government to provide its sanction for the prosecution against army officers in these areas if they have misused or were engaged in extrajudicial killings in such areas. Secondly, it has observed that the AFSPA was an impediment to achieving peace in the regions such as Jammu and Kashmir and the northeastern states. And also, it suggested that the law needs to be reviewed every 6 months to see whether its implementation is actually necessary in the states where it is being enforced. Also, it observed that the law does not provide blanket immunity to the officers because action can be taken but with the prior sanction of the central government, as we have already learned. Again, the BP Jeevan Reddy Commission in 2004 recommended the repealing of the AFSPA law altogether. And it recommended that the AFSPA should be repealed and appropriate provisions should be inserted in the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967. And the Unlawful Activities Act should be modified to clearly specify the powers of the armed forces and the paramilitary forces. Further, grievance redressal cells should be set up in districts where the armed forces are deployed. This is also highlighted by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission that it recommended to repeal the Armed Force Special Powers Act, which was suggested by the BP Jeevan Reddy Commission. It said that its scrapping would remove sentiments of discrimination and alienation among the people of northeastern India. The Commission further recommended to amend the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967, inserting a new chapter to deploy armed forces of the Union in the northeastern states. And it supported a new doctrine of policing and criminal justice inherent in an inclusive approach to governance. So in this discussion, we have seen that there are various arguments in favor and there are various arguments against the imposition of AFSPA in the disturbed areas. In this line, we have seen the observations of Supreme Court, which has highlighted the manner in which the AFSPA should be deployed. Also, what are the necessary actions that should be taken by the central government to stop the misuse of the AFSPA in the northeastern states and the states in which it is applicable. However, the BP Jeevan Reddy Committee and the Second Administrative Reforms Commission have highlighted that this article on page number 6 is related to a controversy that is going on in the state of Kerala related to Lokayukta. In this, Kerala had recently passed an ordinance related to Lokayukta and had proposed various changes. In this regard, the various issues associated with the proposed changes, the reasons that were provided by the state government, and also what are some of the concerns were discussed in the DNS of 8th February 2022. So you can go through this DNS and understand the various issues associated with the Lokayukta Ordinance of Kerala and also some basic issues and facts related to appointment of Lokayukta and the office of Lokayukta. In the description of today's video, a link to this DNS will be provided. So you can go through that video again. With this, we conclude today's discussion, and this is the question for the day.